Tower of London, and unlike most village greens in the country where you'll find swings and slides for kids to play on a cricket pitch or a pub, we've got something quite unique. Our very own execution site. There it is, that stupid glass coffee table, the ridiculous pillow on it, really is where people died, and they chose to commemorate that with modern art. Does anybody like it? Yeah. Awful, isn't it? Please write a complaint. Now that's not to be confused with the public scaffold up there on Tower Hill. Only 6 people lost their lives here, 3 of them Queens of England. But before I talk about them, I'll describe some of the buildings which surround us here on Tower Green. Now everything we've seen so far was designed and built to defend that. That's the White Tower. It's the building I was speaking about earlier. We couldn't see it because it's behind the buildings. It was built in 1078, remember? Henry VIII? What, I feel mad. William the Conqueror instructed a man called Gundulf of Beck. Gundulf, kids, not Gandalf. He wasn't a wizard, okay? He was the Bishop of Rochester, he was an architect. He was tasked with building that. It took him 20 years. Therefore, it was finished in 1098. It's 92 feet tall, and the walls taper in thickness from 15 feet at the bottom to 11 at the top. On top of each turret, you can see there are crowns in gold leaf, beneath which are weather vanes, and these bear the royal standard. And this denotes that this is still a royal palace to this day. This is still a royal palace. Who didn't know that? Everyone knew it? Oh, well, I've said it 7 times so far. Wasting my time up here on it. Right. All of our kings and queens lived in that building for nearly 600 years. The last monarch to do so was King James I of England. Any Scots people here? King James VI of Scotland, he was the same man. He left here in 1603, so it's important to remember, if we were in Buckingham Palace right now, we'd be in no more of a royal palace than the one you're standing in. Very, very important thing to remember. The royal family lived up on the top floor. There are 3 floors below that, one of which is partly below ground. Now, remember the River Thames was much closer to that building? That made it damp, dark and cold down there. And that made it the perfect place to keep
traitors.
Now, I asked this question a few weeks ago. This is true. Someone responded, cheese and other dairy produce. But actually, it's quite close to the truth. Because it was a wine cellar. Stores and provisions were kept down there. Now, the very first man held prisoner here was in the year 1100. Only 2 years after that building was completed. His name was Ranulph Flambard. Ranulph Flambard was a Frenchman. He was the Bishop of Durham. And somebody thought it was a brilliant idea to lock a French bishop in a wine cellar. Bad decision, actually. It took him 6 months, but he slowly made his way through that cellar. He got himself and us, his guards, very drunk, and he escaped. The very first man held prisoner here was its very first escapee. Not the last, though. 32 people have escaped from the Tower of London over the years. It might surprise you to learn. But you are right. It was then used as a dungeon torture chamber, kids, most famously for Guy Fawkes. Guy Fawkes was the man who tried to blow up the Houses of Parliament with 36 barrels of gunpowder in November of 1605. He was captured, brought here to the Tower and asked a few searching questions, which he refused to answer. So they took him down to the basement there and stretched him out on the rack for 3 days. He was finally singing like a canary, and he was executed in January of 1606. The walls are very thick, so you could not hear the cries of agony from outside. Go down there now, though, and listen very carefully. You will certainly hear cries of agony. It is a very, very expensive gift shop. Not very nice. Right, to get in the White Tower, you go around the other side. There's some stairs there. Henry VIII's famous suit of armour, the massive cod pieces in there. Lots of other suits of armour, guns, knives, swords, bows and arrows, etc. So please go inside there. It's wonderful. Down there, you've got the entrance to the Bloody Tower. To its right, a rather splendid black and white L-shaped building. This is known as the Queen's House. It's called the Queen's House because it's the Queen's house. Remember, this is a royal palace. That is her residence inside this royal palace. Now, she doesn't live there, never has, nor never will, but it is occupied by her representative here, the Constable of the Tower of London, General Sir Nicholas Horton. He lives in there with his family. There's a soldier outside, let's guard it. Now, it was built in 1537, and it is the only surviving original timber-framed Tudor building in London. All the others being destroyed during the Great Fire of 1666. Being the residence of such a high-ranking man, it's often been used to house notable personalities. Anyone from Pennsylvania? Hello there, hello, Pennsylvania people. William Penn, the inventor of Pennsylvania, was held in that house for 8 months. He had a difference of opinion with King Charles II about what constituted religion. While he was in there, his father pleaded his case. He was owed a favour by the king. The king agreed to release the son on condition he left the country. He did so, across the Atlantic to found the Quaker colony of Pennsylvania, named in honour of his father. Pennsylvania, I have no doubt whatsoever, is a great state or commonwealth of the United States of America, but it's named after a criminal. Now, one of the last people held in the town, certainly in that house, was a man called Rudolf Hess. Rudolf Hess was the deputy leader of the Nazi Party in Germany, and he spent 4 days in there in May of 1941 before being taken to Wales for his own safety. Now, why anyone would want to go to Wales for their own safety is beyond me, but here we go, that's what they did. Now, what some of you might not realise, during the Second World War, from the months of about September of 1940 to roughly August of 1941, London suffered what became known as the Blitz. Every single night during those months, thousands of tons of Nazi bombs would rain down on this great city. Just over there is the East End of London. 60% of that part of London was flattened. 32,000 people lost their lives here in London, and over 86,000 people were seriously wounded. So this was a really dangerous place to be. After the war, Hess was taken to Nuremberg, where he was tried, convicted and sentenced to life in prison. Pardon me. He served that sentence in Spandau Prison, Berlin, where he was to commit suicide in 1987. And by all accounts, he was an unrepentant Nazi until the day he died. Right, where's the Americans? Yanks, put your hands up. Let's have a look here. Those here. Goodness. Right, just to allay any confusion that you guys are probably suffering from right now, the Second World War started in September of 1939. It did not start 3 years later when you bothered to turn up. Now, if I'm honest, we probably needed your help at that stage of the war. And it's also been the source of endless films, isn't it? About how you won the war for everybody else. So thank you very, very much indeed.
You're welcome.
And if you'd have paid your taxes, Americans, all this history could have been yours. Right. Just behind me here, we've got a tall, skinny house. It's where our doctor lives. This is a community. We've got our own doctor. If he can't help you, go and see the man next door. That's where the vicar lives. And this is his office, the Chapel Royal of St. Peter ad Vincula. We're going in there in just a couple of minutes. Just behind you there is the youngest building here at the Tower of London. It's called the Waterloo Block, named after Wellington's famous victory over the French. Over the French!
Yay!
At the Battle of Waterloo, 18th June 1815. The cannons you see there are captured French cannons from that battle. As I say, it's the youngest building here at the Tower. It was built in 1845 as a barracks for 1,000 soldiers of Wellington's garrison here at the Tower. Nowadays, though, it's got a very different use. That's where the crown jewels are kept. 11.5 tons of gold in there, and over 23,000 diamonds, rubies, emeralds, God knows what. The two largest cut diamonds in the world are in there. One of them, the Cullinan 1, weighs in at a staggering 530.5 carats. Absolutely, yeah, Jesus, it's absolutely enormous. And they're very, very beautiful. And yes, they're all real. Nothing here is full, nothing in there is fake, okay? We see this all the time, people writing in, had a great day at the Tower, shame the crown jewels are just made of glass. No, they're not. They are the real deal. Those two young men outside are British soldiers. And yes, they're real soldiers, put there to guard the crown jewels. They're not actors, they're not people dressed up. The thing he's got in his hand is an assault rifle. The things inside that assault rifle are real bullets. And if you jump over that fence, you will find out how sharp his bayonet really is. Okay? Now, they've not been put there for you to twerk at and do all the other stupid things that people do in front of them. They are professional soldiers. They're not going to laugh or smile or react in any other way. They're looking at you in pity and contempt. Please don't do it. Please treat those young men and women as you would the soldiers, I hope, in your own country. That's a serious point. They deserve our respect, not our ridicule. The crown jewels are beneath that black and gold clock. Just underneath it there, you'll see a queue snaking out the back, but there's a big black door over which it says the crown jewels. Everybody look at that signpost behind you. What does it say on the left-hand side of the sign? Crown jewels. And that sign cunningly points to the entrance of the crown jewels. Are there any questions on where the crown jewels are? No. Keep your hands down. Right, let's turn our attention then to this horrific site just here. Now, remember, only 6 people lost their lives here, 3 of them Queens of England. The first victim was on the 19th of May, 1536. This was, of course, Queen Anne Boleyn. Now, Anne Boleyn died because, she was tried, rather, for incest, adultery and witchcraft, making those accusations what you will. But she didn't want to die in the traditional English manner, which was with the block and axe. Think back to what happened to poor old James Scott, you can understand her trepidation. So she elected to die in the French manner, which in those days was with a two-handed, double-edged sword. This was pre-guillotine days. Now, they couldn't find a skilled Frenchman. Possibly still looking, actually. Have we got any French people here? Probably should have asked. No, brilliant. Right, so they sent off for a man with the necessary skills 7 days before her trial had even started. She was going to die no matter what the outcome. On the morning of the execution, there was a wooden platform here. It was covered in straw. The straw was to soak up her blood, but also to conceal the sword. She mounted that platform, delivered a final speech, fell to her knees and started to pray. Lord, have mercy on my pitiful soul. And she repeated that over and over again. The executioner then distracted her. He shouted, bring me my sword. This made Anne look up, and it put her neck in the perfect position. But he'd already got the sword in his hand. And he used to such devastating effect that when he lifted up the head of the assembled crowd, remember that's the point of law, there was a huge gasp. The reason for the gasp was so quick and efficient had this man been, the head hadn't realised it was separated from the body. Historic records tell us that for 24 seconds after it was removed, the eyes were still looking around the crowd and the lips still moving in prayer. That's quite honking, I think we'll all agree. Both body and head buried inside the church there. 6 years passed before the next Queen perished behind me, and this was Queen Catherine Howard. Now this was an unusual event. Both victims were, or two people rather, executed, one immediately after the other. Both victims were female, and as I say, one of them a Queen of England. Now Catherine was executed for her associations with other men, both before and during her marriage to King Henry VIII. But it was an alleged affair with a man called Thomas Culpeper, which was to be her undoing. The Spanish ambassador of the day that witnessed this execution writes and tells us that her last words to her executioner were, I die the Queen of England, but would rather die the wife of the only man I ever loved, Thomas Culpeper. It's a lovely story, isn't it? Thomas Culpeper didn't think so, because he was stood right where you are. Shut up! He was immediately arrested. He was taken away, and 2 months later was hanged, drawn and quartered at Tyburn, which is where Marble Arch now stands at the western end of Oxford Street, so much she loved him. They took the straw away, it was covered in her blood, they wiped the blade clean, they brought out the next victim. The next victim was her lady-in-waiting, a lady called Jane Boleyn, the Viscountess of Rochford. Now Boleyn, that's a familiar sounding name, isn't it? Now remember, Anne Boleyn lost her life, amongst other things, for incest. And in her case, that kind of involved her brother George. George Boleyn was married to this lady Jane, so she was Anne Boleyn's sister-in-law. She lost her life for a very sad reason, really, and that was that despite being a gossip at court, she neglected to tell Henry VIII about his wife's affairs, and so paid for that with her life. Both of those ladies buried here in our church. 12 years passed now before the next Queen died behind me, and this was the sad, tragic and innocent Lady Jane Grey. 16 years old, and she was the uncrowned Queen of this country for only 9 days. After the death of her cousin, King Edward VI, who was also 16 years of age, she was woken from her bed out at Sion House, to the west of London there by Twickenham, by ambitious relatives. And she was told, you're now the Queen of England. She was brought here to the Tower of London, but she didn't want to be the Queen of England. She recognised, as did most people in the land, that the rightful Queen was a lady called Mary Tudor, or Bloody Mary as she became known. She was Henry VIII's eldest child. Mary got into London with a small army, and she persuaded the Privy Council that she was the rightful Queen. They agreed. They allowed her to come into the Tower with that army, and they had Lady Jane Grey arrested, along with her 19-year-old husband, Lord Guildford Dudley. They were taken to London's Guildhall, just over there, where they were both tried for treason and sentenced to death. They were brought back here to the Tower and languished here for 9 months before that sentence was carried out. Guildford Dudley was in this tower here, the Beauchamp Tower, and his young wife in the second house down, number 5, Tower Green. 9 months later, she was looking out of those windows when she sees her husband dragged from this tower on his way up the hill there for his execution. An hour later, she was still looking out those windows when she sees his headless corpse brought back here for burial inside our church. If that's not anguish enough, for a 16-year-old girl, she must have seen the carpenters knocking up the scaffold for her own execution right here on the same day, the 12th of February 1554. She's also buried in the church. Now I think that's one of the darkest days in this country's history. Everybody comes here and bangs on about Queen Anne Boleyn. Where was that? Oh, sorry, mate. Where was Anne Boleyn executed? Where's Anne Boleyn buried? Anne Boleyn, Anne Boleyn, Anne Boleyn, Anne Boleyn, Anne Boleyn. That's all we ever hear about here is Anne Boleyn, but nobody ever asks questions about this 16-year-old girl who had absolutely no idea why one cold February morning she's kneeling down right there in front of a man with a massive axe about to lose her head. She died very bravely and very nobly. She's a remarkable young lady, and I urge you all to read up a little bit about her. Never mind Anne Boleyn.